It is my pleasure, on behalf of the New York Society Library, to introduce Clifford Thompson, an essayist, memoirist, writer on books, film, and jazz, and also a visual artist. His previous books include Love for Sale and Other Essays, which won the Whiting Writers Award for Nonfiction in 2013, a novel, Signifying Nothing, and a memoir, Twin of Blackness. He's also written for the Washington Post, the Village Voice, the Times Literary Supplement, and many other publications, and has taught creative nonfiction writing at the Bennington Writing Seminars, Sarah Lawrence College, Columbia University, Queens College, and NYU. Tonight's book, What It Is, was published near the end of 2019. NPR has called it captivating, and our library member, Pulitzer Prize winner Gregory Pardlow, says, without insult or hyperbole, Thompson considers reckless and insightful political positions alike with a stunning willingness to risk being made uncomfortable, as much by false virtue as by searing truth. Thompson holds himself to a higher standard of integrity than we're used to finding in our social and political discourse. And now, Clifford Thompson.
And thank you to the New York Society Library for hosting me. I'm very glad to be here. And thank you all for being here. I'm going to talk about my book, What It Is, Race, Family, and One Thinking Black Man's Blues. Here's the book. The book is largely about race in America, and it is about race in America, and it's largely a response, a personal response to the 2016 presidential election. It surprises some people to know that the inspiration, or part of the inspiration for my book, was the work of Joan Didion. For those who are less familiar with Didion's work, she is an essayist, a novelist, a memoirist. She's white. She is the author of books including the classic essay collections, Slouching Towards Bethlehem and The White Album. She is the author of novels including Play It As It Lays, and she wrote a very popular memoir that came out in 2005 called The Year of Magical Thinking, which concerns the year following her husband's death and the diagnosis of her daughter with what turned out to be a fatal illness. So what attracts me, or part of what attracts me to Didion's work, is her way of looking below the surface of things to see what's really going on. Didion does not deal in received wisdom, and she's not one to believe something just because it's what everybody says. An example of this is a piece that she wrote in the late 1980s about the so-called Central Park Five. So in New York City in the late 80s, 5 Black and Hispanic young men were convicted of raping and brutally beating a woman in Central Park. At the time of the case, there was a near unanimous opinion that these young men were guilty on the part of everybody, just about everybody, except Joan Didion. She pointed to the lack of evidence against these young men. And sure enough, today those men who were middle-aged are known as the Exonerated Five, because it was proven that they did not, in fact, commit the crime. So, so that's an example of what I mean by her ability to look below the surface of things. And it seemed to me that there were parallels between the sort of arc or the development of Didion's thinking and the development of my own thinking, which I'll get to in a moment. Joan Didion was born in late 1934. She grew up in California. Like many people who grew up in California, she was raised on just the kind of myth of the self-made man and self-made woman in California. She also believed, I think, in just the American ethos and the kind of the rightness of what America did, whatever it was. And this was symbolized for her by the movie star John Wayne. She wrote about John Wayne in the collection Slouching Towards Bethlehem. And then came the 1960s, which was a cataclysmic decade, just a lot of chaos and confusion. And the events of the 1960s had the effect on Didion of causing her to question her beliefs and question the stories that she had always been told and always believed. She also came to I would say, question the idea of the story itself. In other words, life is just full of so much detail that are, and so many details that are not connected to one another and don't necessarily have any meaning, but we attach meaning to things in order to sort of get through the day and make sense of everything. And a sort of iconic sentence of Didion's is the first sentence of her, the title collection the title essay in the collection, The White Album. And the sentence is, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live." So I would say that Didion emerged from the 1960s, not so much with the idea that that all stories were nonsense, so much as the idea that we are often not told the right stories. And so she seemed to take it upon herself to find out what the real story is, to look below the surface of things and to see what was really going on. And the results of that were books including Miami and her political essays, and essays such as the one that she wrote on the Central Park Five. So I mentioned that I saw a parallel between the development of Didion's thinking and the development of my own thinking. And what I mean by that is there are beliefs that I've always held. Some I grew up with and some I formed as an adult. And just as the 1960s caused Didion to rethink things, the 2016 presidential election had the same effect on me. Among the beliefs I held, some of it involved being a Black American. So it seems to me that if you live in this country and you're Black and you're aware of what's going on around you and what has happened before, you face a choice if you're you're a thinking person. And the choice is between embracing America and embracing the idea of being an American, despite the country's history of oppression of people who look like you, or rejecting America because of that oppression, in spite of the sacrifices of generations of people who came before, so that you could be free. And the decision I made was to embrace my Americanness, to call myself an American, because of the sacrifices of people who look like me, and also because of an idea that I latched onto that is summed up for me in the word improvisation. So what I mean by that is that it seemed to me that over the course of Black American history, there have been instances when Black people faced challenges and they were able to improvise and to find a solution that was not obvious, right? And that involved creativity, creative thinking, improvisation. So, for example, let's say it's the 19th century. You are enslaved. You do not have recourse to legal means to free yourself from slavery. So what do? And one answer to this that Black people came up with was the Underground Railroad. In the 20th century, in the 1950s and 1960s, Black people were faced with trying to secure the rights that we had supposedly been granted 100 years earlier. Again, a problem without an obvious solution, but one result of improvisation in that instance was the Civil Rights Movement. So these are examples of what I mean by improvisation in Black American history. And improvisation has a symbol, which is jazz. The improvisation, the act of improvising is at the heart of jazz. I was already a jazz fan when I made the connection between the idea of improvisation and Black American history. But after I made that connection, jazz became almost sacred, and the act of listening to jazz became almost a sacred act for me. So again, Didion had her beliefs, and the 1960s challenged those beliefs, and I had my own beliefs, and my beliefs were challenged, as I mentioned, by the result of the 2016 presidential election. So, what happened then? A man who received the endorsement of the Ku Klux Klan a man who bragged openly about fondling women he didn't know, a man who ran a campaign based on xenophobia, you know, with the idea of constructing the wall and the whole thing. This man was America's choice as its leader. So I had what I call a sort of Didion-esque moment at that point, and because there were easy conclusions to draw from this. If Donald Trump, whom I consider to be a racist, was the choice of the majority of white voters in the country, the easy thing to conclude was that most white voters in this country are racist, and that most of the country itself is racist. But I wanted to emulate Didion in the determination to get an idea for myself of what was happening, and not to rely on so-called received wisdom, you know, to look below the surface. So in order to really know what was going on, I would have to look into the hearts and minds of hundreds of millions of people, which of course I could not do. What I decided to do instead was conduct in-depth interviews with a small but disparate group of Americans, including people who supported Trump. So in order to do this, I went on social media. I went on Facebook. I wrote, I posted something to my friends. I said, hey guys, does anybody know some Trump voters I can talk to? As it happened, I had two friends in California, each of whom said, well, I have a neighbor who, you know, who you could talk to. And the other thing I said on Facebook was, you know, these have to be people who would not actually want to kill me. And so my friends assured me that that was the case. I talked to another man in the Midwest, in Missouri, and the way I met him was that I had received an email from his daughter to my website. It turned out that her father had served in the Korean War and was looking for a black man named Clifford Thompson, whom he had served with. And so his daughter contacted me asking if I either was that man or was that man's son or was related to that man somehow. I was none of those things, but we stayed in touch. And when it came time to do this project, I contacted the man and I asked who he had voted for, and it turned out he had voted for Trump. So I conducted a lengthy telephone interview with him, and I flew to California and conducted in-person interviews with two other men who were Trump supporters. So the Trump supporters I talked to, what they had in common, they were all 70 or older, all white. None of them considered themselves to be racist, but the more they talked, I would say the more their negative attitudes about people of color came to the surface. They all believed in the essential fairness of life in the United States. You know, the belief that as long as you work hard, you'll do just fine. You'll get what you want. When asked about the situation facing many black people in America, including poverty, they tended to attribute that not so much to outside factors such as racism, but to the values in the black community itself. So in their view, these values had started in slavery and had been passed down through the generations of black people. And so I interviewed these people on the theory that you know, there is just a small handful of people, but I figured that they have. I'm guessing that their attitudes are shared by many others. And so, based on what I heard from these three men, what I sort of concluded was that obviously racism plays a huge part in life in America, but I would say a lot of attitudes toward black people are not attitudes of contempt so much as they are the result of ignorance, in many cases denial of what's going on. And the big one, though, that I concluded is just indifference to the conditions facing black people. The other people I interviewed a woman of Puerto Rican descent who's a social worker in the South Bronx. We had a good talk, and finally I interviewed a man named Philip Smith, who is the founder and president of the National African American Gun Association. Just hearing about the existence of this organization made me want to talk to Mr. Smith. I figured he would have a lot to say, and indeed he did. So, you know, I was talking a few minutes ago about the sort of foundational beliefs of mine, and as an adult, I formed the idea that I would embrace my Americanness. I was raised with the idea that if you have to judge people, it's important to judge people as individuals, not according to skin color. That is something I always believed, and I still believe, but it is one of the beliefs that I found myself reassessing after it came out that the majority of white voters supported Donald Trump. In the book, I talk a lot about an idea I call rootedness, right? By rootedness, I mean the ideas that people have that sort of attach them to the world, the beliefs that by which they are able to navigate in the world. And the thing about it is very hard not to have a sense of rootedness, just to get through the day and get through life. The thing about rootedness, I find, is that it often also can blind you to what is in front of you. So if you are rooted in a set of beliefs, for example, and you encounter information that contradicts those beliefs, often you will dismiss the information, no matter how clearly true it may be. And so I talk about that in the book. The book, the word family is in the subtitle of my book, and so that's because the book is largely about my life as a family man. In what it is, the subjects of family and race intertwine, and they come together at the end in what I hope is a satisfying way. In terms of the structure of the book, the book has an introduction and 5 chapters. The first and second chapters are trace my life and the development of my thinking. The chapters 3 and 4 encompass the interviews that I conducted with the people I mentioned, and chapter 5 is a kind of summation, reflection, and conclusions. As I said, what it is largely concerns family, so I thought I would read a section that is related to family, and also at the end of this section, I get onto other subjects. So this is the section I'm about to read from the book is from chapter 2, and just take a swallow of water. Okay, this is from chapter 2 of What It Is. Trouble often arises from contradiction. There are those contradictions you can live with and those you can't. One of the former for me is having children. I mention being a father not because it makes me special, it hardly does that, but because it makes me representative. Parenthood has given me, all at once and paradoxically, an appreciation for the fragility and preciousness of life, a sense of inadequacy in my role as a shepherd of 2 young lives, and a tendency to wonder what life, all life, is for. How can I feel all of that at once? Let me begin answering that by telling you a story about my wife. Amy grew up in Manhattan with her younger siblings, a sister and a brother. When she was 5 years old, her mother underwent a gallbladder operation. The operation was botched. From then on, Amy's mother was mostly bedridden. Her father, a book editor at the publishing house where he had met Amy's mother, took up the slack where the care of his family was concerned, until, that is, he got lung cancer, which acted on him very quickly. Amy was 11 when he died. For the next 6 years, her mother was in and out of the hospital. Amy was 17 when her mother, too, passed away. For her senior year of high school, she was taken in by the family of a classmate while her sister and brother went to Maryland to live a Dickensian existence with their mother's sister and her family, adding feelings of guilt to Amy's other troubles. Amy, slender and blonde, has a way about her that I don't think is unconnected to the events of her childhood. She is a caring person, utterly devoted to her family and friends. She loves a good laugh, but politeness is not her bag. She can be frank in a way that some find startling. We make, in some ways, an odd pair. I grew up in a family that was polite to the point of indecisiveness. What do you want to do? Doesn't matter, whatever you like. Amy cuts through all that. She knows what she wants, and she tells you what it is. Maybe in life, we seek out the people who supply what we are missing. In any case, I've always seen her manner as following at least partially from the events of her formative years and the lessons she took from them. Life is short and unpredictable. We don't have the luxury of dithering. She has an air of knowing what to do. I admire it. Sometimes it drives me a little crazy. And she never breaks my heart more, this woman I love, than in those rare times when that quality of hers falters. Which brings me to our children. Amy is a terrific mother, maybe the best one I know. But if there are times when neither of us knows what to do, it is because the job of parenting involves fundamental contradictions. There is, for example, the disconnect between your necessary efforts and the way things turn out. Our younger daughter is today a quiet, truly sweet young woman. As a baby, she could cry like nothing and no one you ever heard. Oh my Lord, could she cry. I'm thinking of one summer night in our apartment in the late 1990s. Our daughter, let's call her by one of her nicknames, Louie, was maybe a year old, maybe a little younger. For whatever reason, and Amy and I nearly drove ourselves insane trying to figure out what it was, on this night, Louie simply would not stop crying. Her eyes were slits of misery, her mouth in the shape of a mangled wheel, and good God, the noise she made. Imagine the wails that would come out of you if a rusty nail was slowly inserted into your pupil. And imagine those wails playing on a loop, and you begin to have some idea of what she sounded like, on and on into the night. Someone outside may have thought that that's what we were doing to her, because in the middle of this madness, through the open bathroom window of our third floor apartment, I somehow heard, during one of those rare blessed pauses in Louis' shrieking, a young male nitwit who was standing at the bus stop call up toward us in a sing-song, "Baby, why is the baby crying?" "Because she's a baby, you moron," I yelled back. He must have called the cops. The next day, a downstairs neighbor told us that the police had come to the door but left upon being sure that all was well. Our upstairs neighbor, meanwhile, lost his patience. I distinctly heard him shout, "Jesus!" And the whole time, Amy and I were passing Louie back and forth, jiggling her, cooing at her, feeling more and more desperate, resisting the urge to toss our daughter and then ourselves out the window. Finally, Amy, who was holding her, could take no more. Now my wife and my daughter were crying, and seeing Amy's usual air of assuredness break down, I wanted to cry too. Instead, I said, "Here, I'll take her." While Amy went to try to sleep, I held Louie and willed her to stop crying, and she stopped. Needless to say, she didn't stop because I willed her to. She stopped on her own, and there you have it. You try and try and try, and if you're lucky, things turn out okay, but not necessarily because you exhausted yourself trying, and that, in a nutshell, is parenthood. And those are just the times when you try as hard as you should. Then there are other times when, despite your best intentions, you find yourself asleep at the switch because, in the end, you were not equal to this job you must do. In my memoir, Tone of Blackness, I referred to Louie's older sister by one of the nicknames she had as a little kid, the Pie. Let's keep calling her that. One Saturday in the winter of, I think, 2000, when the Pie was about 6, she and I bundled up and walked a block to Prospect Park so she could sled. The park was frozen over, all white and silver and glistening in the January sun, and packed with families. I don't know what my excuse is. I don't know if I have one for what happened next. Maybe I was sleep deprived from being up during the night with Louie. In any case, I took the Pie to the top of the hill. She got in her plastic sled, and soon she was flying toward the bottom. Before I took in what was down there, jutting up out of the whiteness, a big, hard tree, and a few yards away from the tree, lengthwise and widthwise, a black cast iron lamppost. When I saw the tree and the lamppost, I also saw that my daughter was heading right for them. I ran after her helplessly, footfalls crunching in the snow, shouting her name with as much chance of catching her as of catching a runaway train. She picked up speed as she headed for the tree and the pole, and then she sailed right between them. She was fine, no thanks to me, in spite of me. I don't think a week has passed since then that I haven't remembered that episode, and when I'm in the mood to torture myself, I imagine an alternate ending, the one I deserved for letting my guard down, as I always feared I would. Of course, even when you don't let your guard down, even when you do what you mean to do, you wonder if it's the right thing, because your impulses often go against your mission. I think, too, about one day when Louie was about 3 years old and I took her to another kid's birthday party. The kids played musical chairs, one of the many games devised by adults to torture children. After one of the rounds, Louie came toddling toward where I was sitting, and I'll never forget the way she looked. This was the face of a little girl who had had enough of the rough and tumble, whose defenses were worn down, who simply needed, if only for a minute or two, to be held. I've met parents who would have told their kids in that moment to just toughen up and get back in the game in preparation for a life without their dads to comfort them. Maybe that would have been the right thing to do. But I took Louis onto my lap. Father and daughter, wusses together. Sometimes, in other words, you make mistakes not because you don't love your kids, but because you do. They become the center of your world, in fact. And then, after all that, they leave you. This is as it should be, though I will say that I got a glimpse of the pulling away process that no father should ever get. One warm weekday evening, when the pie was no longer a 6-year-old on a sled, but a sophomore at a Manhattan high school, she hung out with friends in the city. Then she rode the subway back to Brooklyn and called me from the station to let me know she was on the way home. Reassured, I went back to my book or newspaper. 15 or 20 minutes later, I realized she should have been home by now. The walk from the subway was no more than 10 minutes. After another 10 or 15 minutes had passed, I decided to go outside and see if I could spot her. I walked out of the apartment building, hung a right, went to the corner, and looked down the avenue, whereupon I had the following sequence of thoughts. Oh, good, there she is. Oh, okay, she's hugging her friend goodbye. Oh. She parted from the young man, her first real boyfriend, and walked toward me. We looked at each other sheepishly, then went without a word into our building. And that, of course, was just the beginning of the pulling away process, which brings me back to the hopelessly unoriginal yet persistent question of what it's all for. You and your partner or you alone work to build a family. You worry and you worry some more every day until one day your children are grown and, you hope, capable human beings. And then they leave off, you hope, to become productive members of society, to do their part in sustaining that society, leaving you with a hole in your heart. And that's when things go well. Your children may start their own families and produce society-sustaining adults sweating over their children so those children can grow up and leave and maybe start families and on and on. And why? What is the society that our children must leave us to maintain it, that its maintenance requires of us such trial and heartbreak, requires that we deny our laps to our toddlers? And doing so may make them more ready to face the world, but might it not also make them just a little colder? I could be accused here of protesting the existence of dragons, but I don't think that's it. As everyone surely does from time to time, I simply honestly wonder. In any case, these are the contradictions of parenthood, being told, 1, this is your vital mission. 2, you are not equipped to carry out this mission. 3, this mission, like everything surrounding it, makes no sense. 4, go. And of course you go, because that is simply what you do. All parenting is the same, and each job of parenting brings its unique challenges. My daughters, whose mother is white, look pretty different from me. They don't quite look white, but you wouldn't look at them and think black either. This bothered me in the very beginning, not because I could not see blackness in them, but because I could not see me in them, which went against that biological drive that produces children in the first place, the blind desire to continue the species, to recreate oneself. But our bond quickly overrode any doubts. These children were mine, that was all. Of course, what one knows and what the world sees are different. With rare exceptions, such as the homeless man who saw me walking with Louis and said, y'all look just alike. Strangers see me next to my daughters, who have white girls' hair and skin much lighter than mine, and they are thrown, here in the 21st century, for a loop. A college friend of mine, a black man who visits me in New York once a year or so, walked beside me one day as I pushed Louis in a stroller and observed about the people around us. The white people have looks on their faces like, oh, okay. The black people are like, uh-huh. A white cab driver in upstate New York who picked up Amy, Louie, and me came out and asked us, are you guys a family? I could not love my daughters a bit more if they were mirror images of me. I could not love them any more than I do now. Amy and I have tried to teach them to be kind people. Whether or not because of that, they are kind people. I have talked to them about their Black American heritage. When they were younger, I often mentioned to them the African kingdoms of Mali, Ghana, and the Songhai. I don't know if they remember. God knows I've played them a lot of jazz. For the most part, though, their identities, cultural and otherwise, are theirs to figure out. I have done what I know how to do. That is what most parents do for their children. All this is to say that parenthood comprises a set of screaming contradictions that you somehow learn to live with. And then there are those contradictions that simply stop you in your tracks, that pit all you believe and all you are against the reality in front of you. One such contradiction was revealed for me by the election of Donald Trump. That catastrophe does have one factor in common with parenthood. It has forced me to consider things anew, and the two were to lead me to similar conclusions in the end, but I will come to that. So that's that part of the book. I thought I would say a little bit about the art in the book. So here is the cover again. I painted the cover image. I about 12 years ago, I started just painting. And I should back up. As a child, I drew comics. I was very inspired by Peanuts, and also I drew an attempt at a kind of a Peanuts knockoff. And when I got a little bit older, I started writing and drawing superhero comics. When I turned about 18, I became sort of more interested in the writing part of it than the drawing part, and I sort of set visual art aside for a while. And then about 12 years ago, I suddenly started painting like a madman. And just this year, I became a member of the Blue Mountain Gallery, which is an artist collective here in New York City. So I'm very excited about that. About the art in the book, so there are, again, an introduction and 5 chapters, and each of the chapters has an image that I painted that corresponds to it. The thing about the images in the book is that they each show my narrator, but you see him from the back. The idea being that you are seeing what he sees. So that's how the art works in the book. And I thought I would read one last section. I would conclude this talk with one last brief section from the last chapter. So I will do that now. This is, all right, page 154. Here we go. It is not uncommon for a person, especially a black person, to talk about injustices and to be asked in response, "What are you complaining about? You're doing fine," as if having a happy life disqualifies one from acknowledging the pain of others. Those responders are right about one thing, though, at least in my case, the part about doing fine. I have had a good life, in large part for the usual reasons. I've been married for a quarter century to a woman I love. I have 2 great children. I have had the good fortune to find 1 or 2 things I can do reasonably well enough to get immense pleasure out of pursuing them. And then there is this, the joy of what I call being plugged in. I don't use the term the way others do. I don't mean anything having to do with networking or using electronic devices. I refer instead to the excitement I feel over the prospect of learning ever more about the art forms I love. Something akin to faith is involved in the continued desire to learn, a faith that there is value in it, that it is all for something, even if the things learned prove to be their own value. I keep reading, keep looking at art, keep watching films, keep listening to jazz. Jazz involves a tireless exploration that nonetheless acknowledges the limitlessness of what can be explored. One day recently, I walked over the Brooklyn Bridge while listening on my headphones to Alfie's Theme by Sonny Rollins, an experience I recommend to everyone. Rollins's wonderful extended tenor sax solo seems to search, to bore a hole through the earth in its investigation of ideas, even as it suggests the possibility of more to investigate and the still greater possibility, nay, the certainty that we will never know it all. It is a source of both anguish and comfort, though mostly comfort, that I will never get to the bottom of any of it, that I will simply explore as much as I can. And yet every so often comes a voice whispering, for what? Having almost certainly passed the halfway point of my life, what is it that I am so studiously working toward? A body of knowledge and insight that will one day reach its glorious peak so that I can then die? The answer to this is no less true for being a cliche. It's the journey, not the destination, etc. Yes. The beauty of this chestnut is that it can apply to other areas of life. The drawback is that it is easier to think than to feel. To the question, what is the point of raising a family when your children simply grow up and leave, I can answer, at least part of the point is the memories of raising them, the memories they share from the journey too. Except that those memories make me miss them more, not less. The question about the point can be asked about marriage too. I sometimes feel as if I am in silent communion with my wife's parents, who died when she was so young, whom I never met and who never knew of my existence. As if they have entrusted her care to me, not because she can't take care of herself, but because we, all of us, need caring for, protecting. And yet there is no protection, not in the end. Sometimes when my wife and I hug each other tightly, I feel as if we're trying to hold off the inevitable. None of this is to say that the journey concept is not useful. Its value, I think, lies partly in its appreciation of the beauty of the parts as opposed to a concern for the validity of the whole. I may not see my children every day, but I can still smile when I think, for example, of one particular evening. Amy and I and our girls, then 10 and 6, stretched out on our beds at the Windswept Motel in Point Pleasant, New Jersey. As we watched the 2004 Olympic Games on television after a day of hanging out at the beach and the pool, I thought to myself that I would take nothing in the world in exchange for where I was. And this appreciation of the part, the individual, as opposed to the whole, can apply as well to groups of people. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you for listening. Great.
So those who are in the audience, if you have questions and comments, here's one. I will just act as the voice of those questions and others. So one of our attendees says, beautiful writing and very enlightening remarks. I appreciate your references to Joan Didion, who is also so insightful as a writer. Question, is your writing process in any way like jazz improv, or is that comparison not relevant to you personally?
Is my writing at all like jazz improv? Possibly in ways that I'm not aware of. One thing I will say, I would actually move that question back to Didion a second, because one thing I talk about a little bit in the introduction to the book is that I find her writing to be jazz-like in that there are so many dependent clauses in her work. So just in the way that a jazz solo will, or a jazz soloist will play a melody and also take little sort of side detours. I think of Didion as doing kind of the same thing with the many dependent clauses and many commas that fill her sentences. And so in that way, I think her writing is jazz-like. Possibly my own is too, and that I am very fond of setting off phrases with em dashes, and I like a long sentence. I like a sentence with a lot going on in it, and I suppose that those sentences could be compared in a way to jazz solos. So maybe the answer is yes. Yeah.
That's great. I was going to throw in from my own perspective. You mentioned Joan Didion. You list several other authors in the book who were influences on you. One of them is Tom Wolfe, whose name jumped out at me just because he was a member of the Society Library. We knew him for a number of years.
Right.
And I just wondered if you wanted to speak a little bit more about his influence, either sort of philosophically or as a writer, and what parts of his work are relevant today, particularly. Yeah.
Tom Wolfe, I would say Tom Wolfe himself was had a way of trying to just explore the entire world in his essays. I mean, those essay collections from the 60s and 70s, he just explored so many things and talked to so many people, and it was great. And you know, his novel, I've written about Tom Wolfe actually in my book Love for Sale. I have a long kind of a long piece about him, and his novel The Bonfire of the Vanities, I think was a kind of an attempt to get beyond the headlines, the kinds of headlines that appear when something controversial happens, to sort of demonstrate that there are things going on that none of us know about, and to demonstrate the way that reporting about these events tends to be done with broad strokes, and those broad strokes tend to miss a lot. So I think that's a good thing to keep in mind. I think he was onto something with that idea, definitely. Yeah, I love the internet concept of the oddly specific item. You know, and sometimes that's a hilarious sort of meme-shaped thing, but sometimes the oddly specific is exactly what reveals, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. So one of our attendees says, there's a mindset that the arts, sciences, medicine, economies, history is mostly a Caucasian experience and invention, yet the Harlem Renaissance, ancient Egypt, the entire sweep of Black history and multicultural history, yet those histories are often washed or glossed over. How can we remedy this, broaden people's education and sense of what's history? Right. Well, You know, I think people have been attempting to do that for a long time now, and you know, hence, you know, beginning in the 1960s, I guess since then there've been Black Studies departments, and there have been you know, courses and the kind of history that you were not necessarily taught by your junior high school teacher. You know, I think the current moment is very exciting in that I think a lot of people are looking at things in a new way and waking up to the fact that there's a lot that they don't know, and so I think it's important to sort of capitalize on this moment and to take advantage of it. And how do we do that? Wow. I mean, you know, my little sort of modest way of doing it is trying to write about it. You know, the question mentioned the Harlem Renaissance. You know, I've tried to, you know, in my book Love for Sale, I wrote about Rudolph Fisher, who's a name that not a lot of people know, but he was a great writer, and he was part of the Harlem Renaissance. So, you know, just get the word out any way you can. And you know, I think I do think the current moment is playing a part in kind of waking people up to the notion of things that they've missed out on. At least I hope that's true. Good question, though.
Yeah, we hope that's true also, especially speaking as broadly an educational institution.
Yeah.
I mean, we also just provide things that people want to read for all kinds of reasons. But
Yeah.
but piggybacking on that a little bit, I was struck in the book by your, and pardon me, I'm looking at my notes. The central point that if America is the land of the free, does that oblige us to work toward conditions of greater freedom for those who aren't enjoying them? Or are those efforts, and you mentioned affirmative action, a constraint on the free operation of society? And this is a huge theme, but I want to just bring out the small thing, that gap is hard to bridge because it may not reflect a difference in levels of education, but rather different concepts of morality. So can you talk a little bit about where does education get in there? I mean, we're a library, you're a writer. How are we working with this?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, you hit on a key point in the book, which is that, you know, you ask a lot of people what idea defines America, and the first thing they say is freedom, right? So, as I say in the book, freedom is people's concept of freedom is a tricky thing. Freedom does not equal everybody has a good life. It in these people's minds, it means that you are free to get what you can, and what you get is yours, and so you are unconstrained, but nobody's going to help you either, and so. Their idea of freedom is it's like, look, if you have a problem, it is your problem, and it's your responsibility to get over it, no matter what that problem is. That is many people's idea of freedom, and it's, you know, it's the kind of thing that sounds good on paper, but again, you know, a lot of people who say this are not really aware of the conditions that are hampering people from, you know, from taking advantage of this freedom. So. So to the extent that education can bridge this gap, I suppose it is beneficial to make people aware of things like you know, of systemic racism and the true barriers to freedom for a lot of people. You know, how you do that is I guess there are a number of ways. I think the press plays an important role. I've noticed since the murder of George Floyd and the kind of repercussions of that, the language in the newspapers I've been reading has changed a bit. You know, like the New York Times has come out and called things racist, which they did not used to do, and so, you know, if more people are seeing things like this, then maybe that can help educate people as to the barriers that a lot of people face, and and maybe they will kind of rejigger their idea about what needs to be done in order for people really to be free. So that's my long-winded answer to that, I think.
That's great. Let's hope so.
Yeah.
As you were speaking, it also seemed to me that the role of personal narrative is really valid there, because sometimes you can read statistics which may be horrifying but don't necessarily penetrate, but somebody's individual narrative, fictional or non-fictional, sometimes sparks that empathy.
Yeah. Yeah. It's true. I mean, Didion wrote famously that we tell ourselves stories in order to live. And I think, in that situation, like the word story has a kind of a negative connotation, but stories also are very positive, can be very positive things, and one thing has always struck me about just like the sort of journey of Black Americans is that one thing I find very cool is that in just about any area of endeavor you care to name, if there's only one Black person involved, there's going to be that one. It's like we somehow managed to find our way into just about every corner of endeavor, and despite pretty steep odds in some cases, and I find that personally inspiring. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
We have a question from the audience, but a note I had made is so great compared to, alongside what you just said. I'm going to throw it in. So recently we had an event with Jamaica Kincaid, which was fantastic. And of course she's from Antigua, and has lived in the United States for many years. And she commented, if there hadn't been hope in the world, African Americans would have had to invent it, which I just scribbled down because that was great.
That's great. That's great. Yeah. And that sort of comes back to the idea of improvisation, right? It's like, well, you need something, so we need hope, so let's have hope, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So audience member asks, can you talk about your next project or what you're currently working on, and how is the current situation in the country, the Black Lives Matter new emergence, and even the pandemic affecting your writing?
Well, how it's affecting my writing? It's interesting. I've been in a couple of, like 2 or 3 instances. I've had people who are editors of online journals ask me to contribute thoughts to pieces to that kind of speak to the current moment, and so it's forced me to articulate what's in my own head, which has been helpful for me. I'm not sure I would have. Maybe I would have written these things anyway, but I'm not sure I would have. But I'm grateful for that. What I'm working on at the moment, actually, I don't know if you can see behind me, is a drafting table, and I purchased that several weeks ago so that I could do something I've been planning for a long time, which is to write and illustrate a graphic novel. I paint a little better than I draw, so the illustrations I'm not sure will be stunning, but I'm having a ball. So I've given myself the present of a few weeks to work on this full time. So I'm really enjoying it a lot. So
that's terrific.
Yeah.
Best of luck with that. It sounds like great fun to do and revelatory to do. Even
it is great fun. It is. Yeah.
So audience members, feel free to toss in other thoughts. I think we'll kind of move towards closing, but I have a couple more things if this works for you.
Yeah.
So you mentioned in the book about the concept of colorblindness, which we see a lot of people talking about now, which of course comes from the initially very powerful quote from Martin Luther King, "Judge not by the color of one's skin, but by the content of one's character."
Right.
And it was well-intentioned, the idea of colorblindness, I think I can say, but has obviously become very wrong-headed.
Yeah.
And you say, to see a person as an individual is to take into account everything about that person. Color blindness, on the other hand, is the equivalent of not seeing that a person standing up on the subway is pregnant and therefore not even considering offering your seat, which I just liked because it's so New York-y, among other things. Do you think that that kind of wrong-headed sense of that term is getting usefully unpacked now? And do you have thoughts about color blindness and its related things when you're talking about like casting in films or theater, because you're also a film critic? Should people who are demographically similar to the character only play the character, or how does that work?
Right. I do, well, to answer your first question, I do think that notion is being unpacked, and I think it has to undergo some significant alteration. You know, I think its day has passed. And in terms of things like casting, it's tricky. You know, I remember the film version of I think it was Much Ado About Nothing, if I remember right.
Yes.
Denzel Washington was in it, and that was great. And you know, it's like, well, yes, why not? Why not have Denzel Washington in a Shakespeare film? That's fantastic. You know, should if they're making a movie about the life of Richard Wright, should a white actor play Richard Wright? I don't know. I don't want to. You know, never say never. I'm not sure we're at the point yet where, you know, it would be appropriate or widely accepted for, you know, for white actors to play roles that are about people of color. It is my hope before I die to see us get there, to see us get to a place where there is a large enough common understanding that it doesn't matter what the skin color is of the person who is playing, you know, a person of color. I don't know if we're there yet. It's a very tricky matter. So, yeah, that's my non-answer, I guess.
No, well, I think it is complex.
Yeah.
I think for the moment, I'm glad we're at the time when we can watch Hamilton and see people of all kinds of races and backgrounds and ethnicities playing.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yes, that bunch of folks. So,
yes.
So audience, if there's anything else you'd like to toss in, now would be the time. I just want to ask you, Mr. Thompson, if there's something that you're reading or listening to or that you've watched lately that you'd recommend to us on whatever front, just anything that's really good right now.
Oh,
and
boy.
then if there's anything else you'd like to toss into the conversation that we haven't covered.
Sure. Let's see. What have I been reading? I read partly to inspire me during the you know, graphic novel project I'm working on. I read a biography of Charles M. Schulz, who the creator of Peanuts, which was a wonderful biography. I just finished reading a book by Esmeralda Santiago called When I Was Puerto Rican. It's a memoir that came out in the 90s, which was really good, really moving. I just read a book of poems called Don't Call Us Dead by Dinez Smith, which was excellent. I read another book of poems recently by Jericho Brown called The Tradition. I'm just tossing out things that have come to mind. I read the selected poems of Mary Ruefle, which I found really inspiring. I've tried my hand at poems, and I think her work and Jericho Brown's have sort of may have unlocked something in my ability to write poems. I can, you know, I always have a list of books that I plan to read. So I plan to read Toni Morrison's book of essays, The Source of Self-Regard. I put down the autobiography of Leroy Jones by Amira Baraka, but I want to get back to that. So these are the things I'm reading. I do, you know, in terms of, you know, since I wrote What It Is, we obviously are in this very strange moment, and the murder of George Floyd has sparked all kinds of protests that I think are having like the kind of ripple effect that I have not seen in my lifetime. And what's interesting about it is that for me is that, you know, the civil rights movement happened, and Martin Luther King's death and his accomplishments were recent events when my consciousness was forming when I was a young boy. And it seemed to me that we had, as I say in the book, we had sort of stepped into a new world, and that there had been great difficulties before, but now things were, you know, life had gotten better for Black people, things had gotten easier. Of course, I learned over the decades that things had not gotten as much better as I had thought, but it's almost, and you sort of come to the expectation that some things never will improve. But I feel like right now, there's a moment when young people are saying, no, we reject the way things have always been. We are not accepting this. And in a way, it's almost like part two of what happened, of the things that happened like 50 plus years ago. And I hope that really is true. And I find it very exciting to be alive for. It's a hell of a time to be alive in America. You know, it's scary, but it's also kind of invigorating. So
it truly is.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your work and your perspective with us this evening. Audience members, thank you for being here. So we'll close there and see you soon.
Thank you for having me.